There's this common narrative that goes around on the internet that basically says motivation is overrated. We need discipline, bro. And I completely disagree with this. Not 100%, I kind of agree, but discipline's great. Discipline's important. But imagine if you were motivated every single day. You were actually motivated to sit down and study. Then you wouldn't need discipline. So the top performers in the world, the top athletes, the top businessmen, the top anything, sure, they're disciplined. But the reason they got to where they are is because they were motivated. They were motivated to keep going. So that's what I want to talk about in this video, how to actually motivate yourself to study, how to actually do it. Because when you look at all the videos online, all the other study videos that talk about motivation, they only talk about motivation on a very surface level. It's like, oh, bro, go study with your friends, go use colorful pencils, go, how to trick your brain to like studying. Oh, bro, listen to Harry Potter music while you study. These are all very surface levels of motivation. I want to go deep and fix underneath why you're not motivated to study. And I want to make you motivated, because if you're motivated to study, you will get good grades effortlessly. You will destroy your competition, because imagine you sit down to study not because you have to, but because you genuinely want to. How can anyone beat you? And on top of that, it's going to be stress-free because you're actually motivated to do it. So that's what I want to talk about. And here's why I think that, that concept of like discipline, all you need is discipline, why I think that's overrated, is because I never had discipline. For most of my life, I didn't know what self-improvement was. I didn't know what discipline was. I didn't know what, focus was. I didn't know what study videos were. In high school, I was not doing any of that stuff. But I was still getting very, very good grades simply because I was extremely motivated. And this was not always the case before high school. I was not motivated to study at all. I just wanted to go play video games. I was like, I was failing all my tests and everything, but suddenly I was actually motivated to study. So that's what I want to talk about in this video, that process I went through to get motivated and what I've learned, because I've been learning a lot about motivation recently, and I want to help you get motivated to study, because it's not a fantasy. Because that's the thing, you don't need discipline to play video games, for example. You're always naturally motivated. Like, you might be so tired to study after school, but you're not tired to play video games, bro. Suddenly, I would get home from school super, super tired. Didn't want to study, but I'd be like, oh, bro, but I can like play 2 hours of Counter-Strike, bro, no problem. It's because I'm motivated to play Counter-Strike. Motivation is like an energy source from within. And if you're like constantly motivated, you've got infinite energy within you to constantly sit down and study, basically. So I'm not saying discipline is not needed. 100%, not every day you're going to have this kind of like motivation to sit down. And especially in the beginning, when you're building that motivation within you, you are going to need discipline to actually sit down and study. But after a while, when studying actually becomes motivating, you don't need discipline anymore. And it's like, discipline is important, but if you're motivated, you need much less discipline. That's the point I'm trying to make. Discipline is necessary, but if you're motivated, you need much less discipline. I'll give you the practical steps of how to motivate yourself. So I've been reading this book recently called The Art of Impossible that talks about how top performers, peak performers perform. And the first section of the book talks about motivation, and I learned something very, very interesting. Basically, there's levels to motivation. So I'll call it level 0 motivation, is the type of motivation that you see on study videos. It's like, oh, bro, eat a cookie after your study session, study with friends. Studying with friends is fun. Like put a cookie at every single paragraph, so when you finish that paragraph, you eat the cookie. Like these very like surface level motivation that doesn't get deep. It doesn't give you that infinite source of energy I was talking about. That's level 0 motivation. Level 1 motivation, which is like the next level up, is the kind of motivation that students have when a deadline is approaching. Their motivation is fear. The only time most students don't need discipline, the only time they're naturally motivated to study, is if there's a deadline approaching or if there's a test approaching. Suddenly they have a fear that their parents are going to get mad at them. They have a fear that they're going to not be able to get a job. They're going to get a fear that they're not going to be able to graduate. They don't do shit until stuff starts to get urgent. And then suddenly they have a burst of motivation. That's great. That's amazing. It's good that they can work like that. But it's a painful existence where I hate that feeling, man. I hate that feeling when you know there's an exam next week and you just have to study. It's like, oh my God, I've got to sit down and study. I have no choice. It's so stressful. It's so painful. And you don't get your most efficient work done. So don't get me wrong, that form of motivation works, but we can do better. So that's level 1 motivation, fear. Maybe you can have other ways of having fear. Maybe you can have other ways of having fear. Maybe a guy can have a gun to your head and you got to be super disciplined. But the next level of motivation. So the next level of motivation is that the book talks about is like level 2 motivation, extrinsic motivation. Basically, in 2014, I was constantly failing all my tests, all my exams. I was a terrible student. But in 2015, I made my academic comeback, essentially, and in a lot of my subjects, I started doing a lot better. And this was because suddenly I had this second level of motivation, which is extrinsic motivation. So what that means is you're motivated by outside factors. So at least for me, I realized that if I did well on my maths test, my teacher would say, "Good job, Penrose, you did well." And my parents would be proud of me, and I would see my grades go up. I'd see a number on my report card go up. These are extrinsic motivations. So getting good grades, impressing your teachers, impressing the kids around you. One thing I used to do was I tried to impress my crush by doing really well. I would study hard and I'd be putting my hand up in class. I'd be doing well on my test, hoping my crush would notice me. Or I'd message her and I'd help her with her homework and stuff. Bro, don't do that. Don't waste all your time helping your crush with your homework like I did. Learn from my mistakes. But the point I'm trying to make is this is extrinsic motivation. It's when you're motivated by outside factors. Now, don't get me wrong, this helped. This helped me start improving my grades. This got me hyped up. This got me motivated. It works. But the problem is it's not going to last forever. After a while, you're going to stop caring about what your teachers think. You're going to get a girlfriend and suddenly you're not going to care about impressing girls. You're going to get into the real world where there's no grades and suddenly your motivation will go away. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's a very painful existence. I remember, you're working really, really, really hard. Basically, studying is a means to an end. You're studying really, really hard so that for 5 seconds, your teacher will say, "Good job, Penrose," and you'll be happy for 5 seconds and that's it. Or what I used to do at the end of the semester is I would spam the results page. I would literally check the results page I would check the results page hundreds of times a day to see my grade. Actually, it was more cooks than that. Basically, your weighted average would change one day before the actual result got shown. So what I would do was I would wait for my weighted average to change, and when it changed, I would calculate the grade required to make that weight change, and then I would estimate what subject I thought got me that grade. So I was literally so obsessed with what grade I got that I was spamming the results page. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying don't care about grades, don't care about beating your competition, don't care about impressing your parents. That's fine, that's good motivation. But we can do better than that because like I said, it's a means to an end. It still makes the study session miserable because you're only getting 5 seconds of happiness for a whole miserable semester. And it's still not much of a push that's going to get you to sit down and study. And that motivation will disappear with time. So what this book talks about is the next level of motivation. So after a while, I started turning up to my study sessions with this extrinsic motivation to impress people. And then I realized something. I realized that I started to get motivation from within. I started to enjoy studying not because I wanted some external factor, but because I genuinely enjoyed studying and I genuinely was motivated to study. So I'll teach you how I actually managed to get that next level of motivation, because when you have that level of motivation, that's when the infinite energy source comes in. That's when actually sitting down and studying is enjoyable in itself. Sure, getting the grade is cool. Sure, impressing your parents is cool. But you know what else is cool? Sitting down and studying. And this is going to sound cringe as hell. It's going to sound oh my God, this guy's a nerd or something. But wouldn't it be better if you actually were hyped to sit down and study every single day? That's the goal, and it's 100% possible. So I'll talk about the concepts from the book and what I've learned from my experience. Because here's the thing, right? So when we were kids, we were all intrinsically motivated. We were all curious about the world. When I was a kid, I was asking a million questions about the world. I was curious about everything around me. Let me just check this is recording. I was curious about everything around me. But, when you're a kid, you're not asking questions. You're not learning because it's oh my God, why is that leaf green? Oh, I'm going to ask this question to get a good grade. You're not asking questions to get grades. You're not asking questions to impress people. You're just naturally curious. And what happens is you go into the education system where they take learning from this thing that's, we're all curious about. Because, again, something I learned from this book, humans are naturally curious. Once all your survival needs are met, you've got food, water, shelter, sex, all that stuff. Now you become curious. Now you become curious to explore distant lands. So as human beings, we are curious. But what happened is we go to the education system and suddenly curiosity learning becomes this thing that we need to get a good grade. So motivation goes from intrinsic motivation, genuine curiosity, to extrinsic motivation. Okay, now we need grades. Now we need to impress our teachers. And studying becomes a means to an end. Studying becomes a stressful thing. Because deep within you, there is a part of you that loves learning and can actually enjoy studying literally anything in the world. That's truly what I believe. I think you can truly believe to enjoy learning anything. There's always this, people always talk about like, oh bro, you know, find your passion and you'll never work a day in your life. But there's this book that I read that's very interesting called So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport. He basically talks about how passion is not something you find, it's something you cultivate through learning and through gaining skill. So deep within us, we all have natural intrinsic motivation to learn. So I'm going to tell you exactly how to unlock that again. Basically what I learned is intrinsic motivation is a stack. Basically it's a stack of these things: curiosity, passion, purpose, mastery, and then autonomy. I'll talk about exactly how to unlock these different levels. But I was talking about curiosity earlier on. So basically, when hard work feels like play, that's curiosity. So if you can develop that in the subjects you're learning, if you can look for areas in the subject that you're interested in. Because the thing is, our brain is a pattern recognition machine. We naturally make patterns between things, connections between things. And when you're learning, your brain is naturally making patterns whether you're trying to or not. If you become curious and you look for the connections between different subjects, you look for the connections within a subject itself, you start to become curious. You're like a scientist. You're like a guy who's like exploring distant lands. So curiosity is a lot to do with like the story you're telling yourself and how you're pushing yourself to study. So it's kind of how you approach your subject. You have to approach the subject with the curiosity and a deep burning desire to learn. Because yeah, like I said, you can learn to enjoy any subject. That's level 1, curiosity. And I'll give you 2 tips that the book talks about how to develop curiosity. One is look at the history of what you're learning. So for example, when I learned engineering, when I learned maths, I really enjoyed to learn about the history of it. So for example, in engineering, there's a lot of imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers, I won't go too much into it. It's like the square root of -1, which technically the square root of -1 is impossible because you can't have a number that multiplies by itself to make -1. I won't go into it too much. But basically, I learned about the history of it, where for first of all, imaginary numbers were theoretical. Some guy like theoretically came up with it and people were like, this is cool and all, but it's not practical. And then 100 years later, some guy was like, wait a minute, that thing in maths that we thought was not practical, bro, I can use that to help with my electromagnetic theory. When you learn about the history of the thing you're learning, it's kind of like you're getting engaged with the story of what you're learning. You realize that the subject you're learning is basically a story where a long time ago, some guy mixed some stuff together and boom, chemistry was born. A long time ago, you know, some guy in like Egypt wrote some lines in the sand and numbers were born. And then in the 1600s, Newton went to his home during a pandemic and he discovered calculus because he did these things. But when you learn the history of the subjects you're learning and you make the connections, because like I said earlier, learning is about making connections. It makes you curious about the subject. You see the subject as like a pattern, a connection of everything, and it makes it a lot more enjoyable. So that's one thing. Learn about the history of the stuff you're learning. The second thing is to learn the technical language. Because whenever you're learning a subject, because when you learn the technical language in a subject, a technical word might seem like, okay, what's the point of learning this word? But a word represents like a concept. So when you learn a word, you learn like this brand new concept that exists in the world that previously you didn't have an idea of. And when you learn these brand new concepts, you start to make connections between everything. So that's the second thing. Learn like the technical language of the subject that you're learning. When you try to look for connections in subjects, you approach it with curiosity. That's level 1 of the intrinsic stack, curiosity. And then curiosity becomes passion. The more you make connections, the more you get into what you're doing, the more you talk about what you're doing, the more you try to enjoy it, you'll start to develop a passion for it. So this is what I talked about earlier, where passion is not something you find. Passion is something you develop. Like when I first started making YouTube videos, it was a grind. It was like, bro, this is like, I don't want to sit in front of the camera. It's so embarrassing, man. What if my friends find my videos? But after like 20 videos, 30 videos, I started to get into the groove of it and I started to enjoy it. And now I genuinely love recording videos. It's so fun. Like I'm just sitting here. I gotta go actually. I've been sitting here for 2 hours just making videos. It's been so fun. And so passion is something you develop over time. Next is purpose. When you've developed passion, when your focus goes when you go from internal focus to external focus, that's when passion becomes purpose. And now you're doing the thing to actually forward some cause outside of you. Now this is a bit difficult to do in study. If you can motivate yourself to study by seeing that what you're studying will help you with your family in the future. It will help you learn stuff in the future to build your career, to advance society. One thing I like to do that's a bit more practical is helping the students around you. So in my subjects, I would always learn, and I would like get into the group chats and I would try to answer people's questions. And I would like see what they're struggling with and like see, because there's this thing called the Feynman principle where basically the best way to learn is to teach. If you start teaching the stuff you're learning and you teach it to other students, this gives you a purpose for what you're learning. Now you're teaching students. That's the next part of the skill stack. And the final thing I'll mention in the intrinsic skill stack is mastery. There's a quote I really like. The single best motivator in the world is progress. When you're making progress towards something, this is the best motivator. In a weird way, to make progress, you need to make progress. When you make progress, it's like a feedback loop that makes you enjoy it more and more, and it motivates you. Mastery is all about achieving that high level of skill in whatever you're learning. What I really loved about learning maths was it gave you this sense of mastery where you're learning a skill, where you're like, the more practice questions you do, the better you get at solving integrals, the better you get at solving derivatives. And as you make progress in the subject, as you see your ability in the past papers go up, as you see your skill in the subject go up, that naturally motivates you and it pushes you further and further. I hope that helps you get motivated for your subjects. And by the way, if you're interested in me helping you develop a study habit and help you keep your study habit for the rest of your life and work with you very, very closely, keep you accountable, give you intense help, check out the first link in the description. I think it will help you a lot. See you later.